The Syrian army ambushed and massacred the Druze community in Syria, and Israel moved in to defend them, striking regime targets in Damascus to convince the al-Julani regime to back off and withdraw its forces from the Suwaida province. However, around 1,000 Druze citizens of Israel crossed into Syria to defend their relatives from attacks remained there in Syria as of Thursday morning, while Israeli authorities are also trying to track down hundreds of Syrian Druze who fled the fighting into Israel over the last 48 hours. Syria's interim president, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, lashed out at Israel in a speech on Wednesday, saying, "It is striving to dismantle the unity of our people." However, talk is cheap in the Middle East, and what matters is that regime forces have withdrawn from the Druze areas of southern Syria, and the Trump administration announced that an agreement has been reached to end the crisis. However, in addition to hundreds of fatalities, there was another casualty of this war, as prospects for cooperation between Israel and the al-Julani regime are terminated for the foreseeable future. And meanwhile, in Gaza, the IDF continues heavy fighting, and sources say that Hamas agreed to the new map of deployed forces presented by Israel, under which the IDF will withdraw from the Morag corridor. President Trump claims there is good news regarding the Gaza Strip. Welcome to Boots on the Ground. I'm your host, Yair Pinto, reporting the whole truth from Israel, and today, this is a summary weekend edition with everything that we've missed so far in this week. The big surprise this week was, of course, the crisis in Syria, which to everyone joining the Abraham Accords. But that is very difficult to imagine. And against the backdrop of atrocities committed against the Druze in southern Syria, a senior Israeli official stressed, "We have an interest in ensuring the Druze community is not harmed. El-Sarraj's people should get a grip." He added, "The legitimacy that the new regime received has distorted its grasp of reality." However, the regime got a reality check overnight between Wednesday and Thursday in the form of Israeli Air Force strikes on regime targets in southern Syria. And I'm talking about more than 100 missiles and bombs that were dropped in about 90 strikes. Targets included regime vehicles, tanks, and APCs, and in addition, military headquarters in Damascus are in ruins and might have been completely destroyed. The strikes came after Syria violating understandings with Israel that no troops or weapons would enter the demilitarized zone south of Damascus. And then, hours after Israel bombed Damascus, Druze leaders in the al-Suwaida announced a ceasefire with the Syrian regime that includes a partial withdrawal of its forces. However, some factions rejected the deal, vowing to fight until liberation. And elsewhere, United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio also announced an agreement to end the clash, declaring, "We expect the commitments to be implemented." As the dust began to settle on Thursday morning, reports emerged that there have been over 350 fatalities and hundreds more wounded in the clashes, which hopefully are over for now. But there are also reports of war crimes committed by the regime forces, and that will have to be dealt with. And meanwhile, in the Gaza Strip, Golani Brigade forces and the 188th Brigade linked up to complete the opening of the 15-kilometer-long Magen Oz route in central Khan Yunis, eliminated dozens of terrorists and destroyed terror infrastructure. This is a major step towards defeating Hamas in South Gaza. This route now bisects Khan Yunis, and we'll have more details about it and its purpose. At the same time, new maps showing the proposed deployment of IDF forces in and around the Strip have been presented to Hamas, but the terrorist group is still insisting on its maximalist demands. Nevertheless, Israel estimates an agreement is within reach, and the Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir, announced during a visit to the Gaza Strip that we are close to a pivotal crossroads. In related news, President Trump spoke Wednesday evening just before his meeting with Qatar's Prime Minister Abd el-Rahman bin Jassim el-Thani at the White House, saying there is good news about Gaza and a few other things that we are working on. And in another related story, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation announced Wednesday that 19 Gazans were trampled to death near a distribution site in the Gaza Strip because of Hamas, which sent gunmen into the crowd and caused chaos amongst the masses. And finally, there is a lingering threat that Iran will attempt to launch a surprise attack against Israel in an attempt to salvage their lost honor. The Ayatollah regime remains wounded and furious. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, declared in another fiery speech this week that Israel is a cancerous growth. It's Americans' dog. We can strike it much harder. And he added, we are not afraid of the United States. On the contrary, they fear us. This is according to the Iranian supreme leader. The Iranian parliament responded with a demand that Iran not return to nuclear talks unless the regime's preconditions are met. And Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi demands prior assurances that Iran will not be attacked, while some in the regime are now accusing their own president of an attempted coup and even seeking normalization with Israel. It's a wild and unprecedented situation, even by Middle East standards. I'm Yair Pinto, and this is your Boots on the Ground report about what is happening in Israel on day 650 of the war against Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, the Shia militias in Iraq, and all the other armed groups in this region taking their orders from Iran's Revolutionary Guards, the head of the crumbling axis of evil in the Middle East. And a moment before we begin, I call on you to keep spreading the truth. The lies and disinformation about Israel reach millions of people around the world every day. And we, at Boots on the Ground, fight for Israel, and we need you with us. Every comment, every like, every share makes a huge difference. The most important thing that you can do, guys, is hit that subscribe button and pray for the peace of Jerusalem. 1 second before we dive into all the details of the protection that the IDF provided to its Druze brothers, I want to remind you about the economic crisis that is deeply affecting millions of people in Israel. We must not forget, right now, families across Israel are struggling. Children are going to bed hungry. Holocaust survivors are living alone with empty fridges and no one to help. This is real. This is urgent. And you can make a difference. Our partner for today is Meir Panim, and they are on the ground feeding the hungry, caring for the forgotten, and restoring dignity to those who need it most. But they cannot do it alone. They need your help. Every gift, every donation means a hot meal, a kind smile, and hope where it's needed most. So guys, do not wait. Go to bless-israel.org. Again, that's bless-israel.org. Together, we can bring comfort to the people of Israel after 650 days of war. Together, we can feed a nation with love. Now, let's get back into the news. And we're starting with the big surprise story of the week, and that's the crisis in Syria. It started earlier this week with localized clashes between Druze and Sunni Bedouin tribes in the Es-Saweda governorate of southern Syria, adjacent to the Mount Hermon, which is under IDF control. These clashes escalated rapidly, and despite Israeli warnings that the El-Julani regime must not send forces to aid the Bedouin tribes in attacking the Druze, they did just that, and the IDF responded with warning strikes on regime tanks and armored vehicles at first. Then, when that did not persuade them to back off, heavier strikes, including on regime headquarters in Damascus, were initiated. This included a symbolic but highly effective strike on the entrance gate to the General Staff compound inside the Syrian Ministry of Defense complex. And according to reports, two separate strikes targeted strategic buildings in the heart of the capital, Damascus, near central Umayyad Square, an area identified with the regime's general headquarters. Two Syrian security sources said there were fatalities amongst the regime's security personnel in the most recent strike, and one Syrian channel even claimed Israel was creating a belt of fire around the general headquarters. It was later reported that a strike also hit the rear section of People's Palace, El-Julani's official residence in Damascus. After this wave of strikes in Damascus, Israeli aircraft struck Syrian regime military targets in southern Syria, including in the Druze governorate of Es-Suwaida, and the IDF spokesperson added that regime forces, including armored vehicles which were heading towards Es-Suwaida, were also attacked. The campaign of airstrikes in Syria this week included the launch of over 100 bombs and missiles from piloted aircrafts and UAVs, striking various tactical and strategic targets, all personally overseen by the Air Force Commander, Major General Tomer Bar, from the Air Force War Room in the Kiryat in Tel Aviv. The IDF assesses that the regime's military headquarters in Damascus was badly damaged and that firing positions, arms depots, and other Syrian regime military targets in southern Syria were also hit. An IDF spokesperson office statement said that the IDF continues to monitor developments and the activity against Druze civilians in southern Syria, and in accordance with political directives and strikes in the area, and is prepared for various scenarios in this situation. So those scenarios include a continuation of the process which began on Monday evening, when regime forces, including tanks and even rocket launchers, were observed moving south towards the Druze stronghold of Es-Suwaida, contrary to the demilitarization policy that was agreed with the regime and Israel, which bans heavy weapons in southern Syria for fear of a threat to the Israeli civilians. It is important to point out that before launching strikes on these heavy weapons, Israel attempted to communicate to the regime through the Americans that this was not acceptable and the regime forces must be withdrawn immediately. The IDF waited almost 24 hours for the regime to respond to these communications, but when the heavy weapons were not withdrawn but instead continued to move south, the IDF took action at the direction of the political echelon of Israel. The IDF statement added that these moves were prompted by eyewitnesses' accounts of the atrocities that the regime forces had committed against the Druze population of Es-Suwaida. The statement added, "There are difficult scenes, great brutality, murder. We have been tracking El-Julani's administration for a very long time. These are former ISIS men who have not changed their nature." The statement added that there are layers of complexity to this operation, including the fact that the Druze residents, their Sunni Bedouin attackers, and the regime forces are all wearing similar clothes and using similar weapons and equipment, making it very difficult to distinguish them on the battlefield from each other. It is also a complex physical terrain, as the city is built on a mountain that also includes wooded areas. And amidst the airstrikes, the IDF ground forces and the border police units were also deployed on the Israeli side of the border in an effort to prevent spillover of the violence. However, estimates are that hundreds and possibly thousands of Druze residents of Syria have crossed into Israeli territory in an attempt to flee the attacks, as the IDF says it is preparing for several days of intensive operations. By Thursday morning, large resources have been shifted to the Syrian border from other sectors in Israel, including UAVs, strike units, and intelligence units, with a clear focus on hitting regime forces and preventing a mass exodus of refugees into Israeli territory. And Division 98, currently operating in the Gaza Strip, was instructed to prepare to move north, while Division 35 also received a warning order alongside another reserve reinforcement. And Defense Minister Israel Katz, who warned earlier this week that the response threshold would rise before Damascus strike, stressed that this represents a new policy phase. He added, "Signals to Damascus are over. Painful blows are coming, and the IDF will continue to operate forcefully in Saweda that attack the Druze until they fully withdraw. Our Druze brothers in Israel, you can trust the IDF to protect your brothers in Syria. The Prime Minister and I made a commitment and we will keep it." In response, the El Julani regime condemned the actions in Saweda, calling them illegal. A statement from the Syrian presidency said, "We will not allow harm to the security of area of residents, and those involved in the events will be brought to justice." To make a brief comment on that, the regime might have been sincere in its desire to bring the clashes between the Druze and the Bedouin tribes to an end and restore order to that area. But the military units that they sent to Saweda to accomplish this mission had their own plans to join the Bedouins in attacking the Druze. If the regime wants to bring someone to justice, they should start with their own forces, but that might not be possible. In any case, Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar addressed the events in Syria, saying, "What is happening there in Syria shows horrifying scenes of civilian murder and humiliation. What else must happen before the international community raises its voice? Harm to the Druze community, with whom we have a strong, close bond, must be prevented." About the Syrian regime, he added, "It was not chosen democratically. It seized control by force of arms." And amidst all of this, about 1,000 Druze citizens of Israel, mostly young men of fighting age, crossed into Syrian territory in order to reinforce their brethren over the last 48 hours. Most of them remain in Syrian territory despite appeals, including by Prime Minister Netanyahu, for them to return to Israel and allow the IDF to confront the regime's attacks. Almost all the crossers gathered in the Hadar area, and now the IDF is trying to block exits southward from the village towards the Syrian interior and Saweda to prevent total loss of control and the youth's travel to Jabal el-Druze. Efforts also continue to persuade them to return to Israeli territory, and the army is checking whether any soldiers are amongst the youths who crossed. Personally, I find it hard to blame these guys for what they're doing there. However, I also agree with those voices saying that the IDF needs to be able to act to prevent the situation from getting even worse with more people on the ground, and especially Israelis. The presence of large numbers of Druze citizens of Israel moving to Syria, while other Druze moving to Israel, makes the situation even more complicated. Guys, that is why we were glad to hear the news late Wednesday afternoon that senior in Saweda announced that they had reached a ceasefire agreement with Syrian regime forces. The regime likewise announced a ceasefire, but it is unclear whether it is actually being implemented on the ground, as such high-level announcement can take a while to trickle down to the ground level. For instance, a Druze community leader in Syria, Sheikh Hikmat el-Hijari, rejected the deal and called for continuing the struggle until Saweda is liberated. He added, "There is no agreement or negotiation with the armed gangs calling themselves the government. Anyone or any entity that deviates from the united position and makes contact or an agreement will bear responsibility." With that having been said, public statements have given us a rough outline of what has been agreed between the regime and some factional leaders. The Syrian National Army is supposed to withdraw from Saweda and allow the government's residents, that is, the Druze, to control its security. This appeared to be happening late Wednesday evening and continuing on Thursday morning. And according to local Druze leaders, the agreement also includes a commission of inquiry that will be established to examine the atrocities against the Druze, which reportedly included executions of civilians by regime fighters and their Bedouin tribal allies, public humiliations in which Druze sheikhs and their mustaches were shaved, and looting and burning of houses. It's important to remember that control of Suwaida has long been a key issue in the region's tension, as Suwaida is home to the largest Druze community in Syria, about 700,000 Druze who fear harassment by the al-Julani regime. Some leaders in this community have openly expressed their desire to form a stronger alliance with Israel, but that would be a very complicated process. So guys, here at TBN Israel, we will continue to bring you the whole truth about what's happening now in Syria. This is the most pressing matter of this region currently. So let's continue to pray for the people of Syria that they will have peace. And let's help share the truth by hitting the subscribe button. It's very important to understand why the Druze of Syria are afraid of the al-Julani regime, which includes elements who openly declare their intention to return to the Druze to pure Islam, because it's a different religion, and otherwise undermine their way of life. It's also important to remember that regime forces already engaged in massacres of Alawites and other communities of minorities in Syria earlier this year, so everyone knows what they are capable of. In April of this year, there were already hard clashes between Druze residents and regime forces, resulting in over 100 fatalities. In May, the clashes ended with an agreement, and since then, Druze fighters have held security control in the government. However, as events of recent days have shown, things can change very, very quickly. Looming over all of this is the quiet attempts to establish peaceful and productive relations between the regime of Syria and Israel. The clashes in Suwaida this week cast serious doubts on the ability of Israel to trust the regime, which obviously has internal differences over priorities and goals, as well as competing internal power centers. There is no doubt that Julani wants to work with the West and also with Israel. He knows that he needs a lot of help to rebuild his shattered country, especially the economy. This is after the long and extremely violent civil war which began in 2011 and continued until last year. Israel is also interested in coordination with al-Julani against common enemies, especially Hezbollah in Lebanon. Al-Julani has tried to create an image of a moderate leader, and until recently, there was a good chance of Israeli-Syrian cooperation. But now, the situation on the ground is completely different. The problem between the Druze and Julani is that most Druze are unwilling to hand over their light and medium weapons to the regime and do not want to arm the regime units in their areas. It's impossible to forget that al-Julani was a member of Al-Qaeda. This is in the past, and even if he tries to put that behind him, he's surrounded by men who are still very much of that mindset. It's possible that some military commanders acted without the president's approval in this situation. What do you think? You think that's a possibility? So Julani's office declared that he is against harming the civilians and that the offenders will be punished, but the office did not state that the president opposes the military action itself. And you cannot send an armored force dozens of kilometers south of Damascus without the involvement of the Syrian general staff. So with all of that in mind, al-Julani delivered a pre-recorded speech on Thursday morning accusing Israel of sowing divisions within Syria, and adding that its actions regarding the Druze-Bedouin clashes in Suwaida escalated the situation. He added, "We will deal with attempts to create chaos in our unity. There will be no place for that in Syria. The Druze are an inseparable part of the nation's fabric, and protecting their rights is our top priority." So, to sum up, it seems an agreement has been reached, and al-Julani is saying some good things about holding people who committed atrocities responsible. But it is important to remember that after the massacre of the Alawite community carried out in March by forces aligned with the new regime, he issued condemnations and similar promises to investigate the atrocities and punish those that are responsible. Yet, no significant change appears to have taken place so far, and in the past days, clashes underscored the scale of the security challenge facing the regime in Syria, which came to power in December in a coup that ousted dictator Bashar Assad and still struggles to fulfill its promise to unite all of Syria under a single government entity. Al-Julani himself has tried to project a pragmatic image, especially to the West, but the undeniable fact remains that he depends on the support of men who have not left the jihadist past behind, and Syria's minorities have no choice but to prepare for the worst. So with that in mind, we will pray for the safety of our Druze brothers who have fought shoulder to shoulder with the people of Israel throughout all of Israel's wars. So we will keep embracing them and sending much love, and we invite you to keep standing for the truth, share, leave a like, leave a comment, and most importantly, do not forget to hit that subscribe button. Now, we're shifting our focus to the Gaza Strip. After the Philadelphia and the Morag corridors, the IDF has completed a new corridor in the southern strip that splits the enclave's second largest city into two. The army announced on Wednesday morning that in a special division operation of Division 36, the 188 and the Golani forces finished opening the Magen Oz route near Khan Yunis. The route was completed amidst ongoing negotiations for a hostage deal and a ceasefire, where the main sticking point is Israel's demand to establish a humanitarian city on the ruins of Rafah between the Morag and the Philadelphia corridors. The new route may become an additional bargaining chip in the proximity talks. But beyond that, for several weeks, Division 36 has been operating in Khan Yunis to destroy terror infrastructure and eliminate militants. The new corridor now separates east from west Khan Yunis and runs perpendicular to the two routes south of it. In a related story, the American aid group GHF, which distributes food in Gaza, announced on Wednesday morning that there were 20 fatalities amongst Palestinians who attempted to approach an aid distribution center near Khan Yunis, and according to the group, the GHF, 19 were trampled after Hamas inserted gunmen into the crowd and sparked chaos amongst the masses. One additional person was fatally stabbed. The NGO's CEO declared that we have solid reason to believe that individuals within the crowd, armed and affiliated with Hamas, deliberately incited the riot. He added that for the first time since the aid organizations began, GHF staff spotted several weapons in the crowd, and an American employee was threatened at gunpoint by a militant during the incident. GHF said the event reflects a very troubling pattern in recent days. False messages about the opening of aid sites, including Wadi Gaza and the long-closed Tel Sultan site, have been widely circulated on Telegram and other platforms, causing confusion, driving crowds to closer sites, and fueling disorder. Last night, the group posted an Arabic warning on Facebook, urging Gazans in need to ignore these misleading messages and rely on the GHF official channels for updates. The statement added that we mourn the lives that were lost today, and we remain committed to delivering humanitarian aid as safely and as responsibly as possible. GHF exists to serve Gaza's residents with compassion and integrity, and our mission has never been more urgent or challenging. Elsewhere, the Security Cabinet convened on Wednesday evening to discuss the ongoing talks for a ceasefire and a hostage release, and meanwhile, negotiations in Doha, Qatar, have advanced on the continuous issue of IDF withdrawal maps from Gaza. The Israeli delegation presented new maps yesterday, but no agreement has been reached so far, and contacts are expected to continue for at least a few more days. Sources familiar with the details said there is significant progress but no breakthrough, noting that the Prime Minister gave the Israeli negotiating teams far greater flexibility and decision-making options to reach a deal. And meanwhile, IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir was expected to present the cabinet with a new plan to establish the humanitarian city in the Rafah area after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu previously requested more realistic timelines. The updated plan is expected to be cheaper, shorter, and more practical, and Zamir was also set to outline his operational plan for continued fighting and forced deployment should an agreement with Hamas be reached. So guys, here at TBN Israel, we'll keep spreading the truth, and we invite you to stand with Israel and support us. We need you to continue so that we can reach more people with what's happening in Israel so that they will know how to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Now, we continue to keep our focus on the hostage release negotiations, as United States President Donald Trump met with Qatar's Prime Minister Abdel El Rahman bin Jissam El Thani, telling reporters before the meeting that there is good news regarding Gaza and a few other things that we're working on. It's likely that President Trump was referring to progress that has been reported in the talks in Doha, which came after Israel signaled a willingness to be flexible on the issue of perimeter security in the Gaza Strip following a ceasefire. However, Israeli officials clarified that the pullback would be only temporary, lasting 60 days, and there are plans to resume fighting once the ceasefire ends. An Israeli source involved in the talks said that the flexibility paves the way for a deal. However, officials noted that their sense from the conversations with the Prime Minister is that he strongly wants an agreement in the coming days, but is not interested in ending this war. Also on Wednesday, the Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir told IDF commanders and soldiers, "We are close to a very significant crossroads. In the coming days, we will know whether we have a deal or not. If a deal is reached, we will halt and reposition along the lines defined by the political echelon. If no deal is reached, my directive to the Southern Command is to intensify and expand the fighting and destroy Hamas beyond what we're doing now." Here at TBN Israel, we will keep bringing you all the updates. So guys, please leave a comment, leave a like, share, and hit that subscribe button to help us reach more people with what's happening in Israel. The end of Operation Rising Lion against Iran presents Israel with new opportunities alongside complex challenges. The focused strikes in Iran was an unprecedented military and intelligence success that has, at least for an unclear period, removed a dual existential threat to Israel's citizens. Yet, alongside understandable satisfaction, moving to a ceasefire with Iran places Israel before a more tangible set of challenges than ever. For most, is the creation and implementation of an effective enforcement mechanism on Iran's actions while managing parallel arenas and fronts and maintaining high continuous coordination with the United States of America. However, there is much that Israelis can point to with satisfaction. The operations in Iran were bold and precise. The objectives set by the War Cabinet were fully achieved, including major damage to the nuclear project and establishing significant obstacles to its rehabilitation. Beyond that, the IDF dealt severe blows to Tehran's ballistic missile array and launch capabilities, as well as senior command and control structures of the IRGC and the army. All this sent a clear message in the spirit of the Begin Doctrine, that Israel will not accept a reality in which an enemy builds capabilities threatening its existence. Nevertheless, the campaign is far from over. Iran is injured, not destroyed, and now this regime is also angry and vengeful. Israel's intelligence echelon estimates that retaliation is only a matter of time. Tehran is expected to switch on its emergency generator, crossing what were once red lines, such as attempts to target senior Israeli generals or political figures and civilian targets in Israel and abroad. The next phase of this conflict will therefore require solid, effective enforcement mechanisms to prevent the enemy from rebuilding, halt deterrence erosion, and ensure that Israel does not again face an existential threat while allowing it to thwart other security theaters and defend the Jewish state against any enemy worldwide. However, Iran also has a big problem that will distract it from their plans to take revenge against Israel. This problem is in the wake of the conflict with Israel and the ongoing unrest inside Iran. President Masoud Pezeshkian faces serious accusations from conservative elements that he is undermining Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. More than 30 members of parliament have demanded his removal, signaling deep power struggles emerging after a brief semblance of unity during the fighting. Criticism of the president comes from the hardline wing, causing him of not being aggressive enough. This is the accusation, not being aggressive enough against Israel and undermining the principles of the Islamic Revolution. Member of Parliament Abulfazi Zakharavad, a former ambassador, said in a widely circulated video that Pezeshkian's government would end the Islamic Revolution before his term ends. He added that some believe that ending Khamenei's rule will open the way to a new era in which Iran could join the Abraham Accords. Asked if this was a coup, he replied bluntly, "What else could it be?" Though these statements seem extreme, they reflect deeper fears in Tehran about the regime's future after Khamenei's era and the supreme leader's prolonged absence from public view during and after the Israeli strikes was only reinforced this sense that there is a change, and no one can forget that he is 86 years of age and have long been rumored that he is in poor health. President Pezeshkian himself indirectly addressed the tension this week, telling his staff that no one has the right to impose their views on others, and opposition is not necessarily enmity, he said, and insiders should not be favored through force. This kind of common sense calls the hardline regime's narrative into question, and hardline regimes that rely on terror and brutal force are always very sensitive to this kind of things. So guys, however, another thing that hardline regimes are sensitive to is the need to maintain internal cohesion in the face of external threats and opposition. And with that in mind, even within Khamenei's inner circle, voices expressed reservations about attempts to weaken the president. Reformist camp figures warn of a deep rift. Ali Rabei, a former government spokesperson, wrote in an editorial published this week by the Etmad newspaper that the dust from the explosions has not yet settled, yet the noise of internal rupture is already louder than the blast of missiles. He added that internal disintegration must be prevented, which is exactly the attacker's aim. Elsewhere, nuclear scientists and former Member of Parliament Ahmed Shirzad called on the government to include the public in decision-making, stressing that only if citizens feel represented can the regime be stabilized. Shirzad is right, and here in Israel we have this thing called democracy that is based on citizens being represented in their government. It's messy and sometimes it gets really intense, but it works pretty well most of the time. I look forward to a day when Iran's people have such a government, and I'm sure that they'll like it a lot better than what they have now. Guys, in the meantime, here at TBN Israel, we will keep reporting on every development, so guys, follow, share, like, and most importantly, pray. Let's pray for the people of Iran that need our prayers. Let's pray for them to have better leadership, good leadership. Let's pray for wisdom to our leaders, to the leaders of the United States, of Europe, and everybody who's involved in this conflict. They need to make some very tough decisions. they need our prayers. Let's pray for all the soldiers of the IDF that are fighting. Let's pray for our Druze brothers and sisters that are under attack. Let's pray for a solution that will be peaceful and beneficial, and for a peace between us and Syria. Let's pray for that. Let's pray for our hostages to come back home soon, healthy. And let's pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Thank you for watching, guys.
Hello, this is Mati here in Jerusalem with TBN Israel.
This is Yair Pinto from TBN Israel here in Jerusalem. TBN Israel is keeping viewers informed with Israel-focused news, culture, and what God is doing in this land.
Support TBN Israel today online at tbn.org/Israel. Thank you.